Good evening. My name is Dave. Thank you for joining our live interactive telephone town hall. We're hosting tonight's event to give Congresswoman Spanberger the opportunity to hear directly from you and answer your questions about the issues facing Virginia's families and economy. As I mentioned, this event is an interactive forum. Congresswoman Spanberger will be taking as many questions as she possibly can during this event. If you have a question, you can press *3 on your phone keypad at any time, and we will place you in line to speak with a member of our staff. They'll take down your name and where you're calling from. The next time you hear your name, you'll be live on the call, and you'll be able to ask your question directly. You can also ask a question by submitting one through the portal below our online streaming player at spanberger.house.gov/live. Again, that's spanberger.house.gov/live. If you're watching on Facebook Live tonight and you wish to ask the Congresswoman a question, we encourage you to visit the online streaming portal so you can submit your question. Additionally, if you'd like to receive updates from our office via email, please press *6 on your phone keypad at any time, and our operator will collect your email address. We could receive a lot of questions during this event this evening, so if we're not able to address your question, please call our district office at 804-401-4110 during normal business hours. Again, if you have any questions throughout the event, please press *3 on your keypad or type them below the streaming player. Now, please welcome Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger.
Hello, everyone. I'm Abigail Spanberger, and tonight I look forward to hearing from you about the issues that your families, your businesses, and your communities are facing. I hope many of you are looking forward to Easter and Passover celebrations, and for those in the midst of the month of Ramadan, I hope you are having a good fast. One of the main issues that I hear about when visiting with our neighbors across the 7th District is the economy, the state of our recovery, how prices continue to rise, and how families are finding it tougher and tougher to plan for the future. So a primary focus of mine in recent weeks has been to help address the supply chain challenges we face. In particular, I have heard from Virginia's trucking industry about chronic challenges with both hiring and retaining skilled drivers. And as we all know, the ability to move goods is paramount to our ability to have a healthy supply chain. So I have a recent update on this front. In response to these concerns, I have introduced a bipartisan piece of legislation, the Strengthening Supply Chains Through Truck Driver Incentives Act. Yes, it's a bit of a long title, but it very clearly states what the bill is intended to do. I introduced this bill earlier this month. I teamed up with Republican Mike Gallagher from Wisconsin to introduce this legislation, and we are in the process of gathering more and more support for it. Our bill is very straightforward. We create refundable tax credits for both current CDL drivers as well as those in apprenticeship programs to help both attract and retain drivers. And I have heard directly from many Virginia organizations that are very supportive of this bill because they know it would encourage more young people to enter the industry. It would reduce headaches for our trucking businesses and the companies that rely on them to haul goods. And it would make sure that those who are already on the road are rewarded for their hard work, and that we as a community recognize the real value and the essential nature that the essential nature of their work to our supply chain. Of course, this is just one way that we can combat rising prices and shortages, and I look forward to hearing your ideas and concerns as well. Before we begin taking questions, I want to make sure that everyone listening is aware of the services that my office can provide. Our team can help you secure backlog benefits, get fair treatment from agencies like the VA, help track down delayed IRS refunds, and in recent months, we've also been able to help small businesses receive their emergency loans. So if you are having any challenges contending with or dealing with a federal agency, please know that we are here to help, and I invite you and welcome you to reach out to our office to see how we might be of assistance. Just in the last week, I'm happy to report that our team has surpassed $15 million in casework funds returned to 7th District constituents. That number includes nearly $4.5 million since the beginning of this year. And what that represents is those are benefits that veterans have earned. Those are Social Security dollars that Retirees have paid into the system and should be able to pull out. Those are EIDL loans and SBA loans that constituents should be eligible for but have been unable to attain on their own without support. And so this is the help and the constituent services that my office can help you with. Also, any challenges with the Postal Service or with passports, please do be in touch. We can help you, or at least try to help you with every federal agency. If you or someone you know would like to get in contact with our office, please do not hesitate to give us a call, 804-401-4110. You can get in touch with us there or on our website at spanberger.house.gov. Thank you for joining this evening, and I look forward to taking your questions.
All right, thank you very much, Congresswoman. And we're going to get the lines open here. We're going to start off with Trina. And Trina has a question about getting in touch with the IRS. Trina, what is your question for the Congresswoman?
Well, my question was, I helped my mom email the office, and we clicked on the IRS department. And basically, my father passed away in 2018, and after she filed taxes, that went okay. But the following year, the IRS listed her as deceased, and they won't change it. They blame the Social Security office. Social Security office says it's not us, it's them. Reapply for your passport and your Social Security card, and it'll make you a citizen again, and then you'll be back in the system, and you'll be able to do it. But nothing's working. She never got any of her stimulus. She can't file. I mean, they take taxes out of her paychecks, but they're not letting her file her taxes. They're not letting her pay. They're not letting her get her refunds because they say she doesn't exist. And so a representative did call her back and say, we need to email you some information so we can get more information on you, and they just never did it. And so she's called the number back, and they just haven't returned her call.
Well, Trina, I want to first begin by saying I'm so sorry with your father's passing. This is not what your mother should be contending with. And so my office is happy to help. I appreciate you being willing to share your story during the town hall, because I do hope that anyone listening will understand that these are the sorts of circumstances that we can provide assistance with. So I'm going to go ahead and take your information, or have one of my team members take your information off the public aspect of the line. But just for the purposes of the town hall, I wanted to let everybody know that what will happen next is we'll follow up with Trina and her mother and open a case. And what that means is we'll file for privacy disclosures. We'll need Trina's mother to give us permission. Trina will need your mother to give us permission for us to do an inquiry on her behalf, to look into her circumstance and to receive some correspondence between us and the IRS. And then moving on from there, we'll be able to follow up on this circumstance, ensure that we can assist in this inquiry and make sure that we get it fixed very, very quickly. So I look forward to working with you and your mother. I'm so sorry for these circumstances, but hopefully we'll be able to assist you in getting answers. And so we'll move you off the public line so we can take your details and have someone from our team follow up with you. Thank you so much.
Next up, we have Richard, and Richard has a question about the border and illegal immigration. Richard, you're on live with Congresswoman Spanberger.
Thank you, Congresswoman Spanberger. I like a lot of the things you're doing. My concern continues to grow on the border on immigration. I know you've done some action on that for illegal drugs and whatever, but this is just expanding at an expanding rate. You know, we're going to allow 100,000 Ukrainians to come in, which have valid reasons to come in, but that's half a month's supply that's coming across the border right now. There needs to be some immediate controls put on that, particularly when the Title 42 is being released. That was kind of a lame excuse to stop people, but there needs to be some bipartisan action immediately to stop the drain on the drain across the border, because there's costs associated with that for the long term. I'd like to know what's the latest that you may be doing on to stop this.
Well, thank you for this question, Richard. And certainly the latest that I've been doing is as of about 10 minutes ago, I was putting the finishing touches on kind of a formal correspondence that I plan on following up with the Department of Homeland Security. So Let me just outline some of the concerns that I have, which may be similar to yours and may be different, and then go from there in explaining my take on what comes next. Certainly, I am proud of the fact that the United States continues to be an extraordinary place, a beacon of hope, a destination that so many people only dream of ever getting to. We are a land of opportunity. We are a country of immigrants, and that is what has made us strong throughout our history. We also are a country where we need to have law and order along our borders, be they our points of entry at airports or points of entry along the southern border or the northern border. And really what we are contending with is ongoing challenges, in part because of COVID, in part because of natural disasters throughout Central America that over time have sent people looking for refuge, again, in the United States. And now with the crisis in Ukraine and the invasion of Ukraine by the Russians, we see Ukrainians fleeing mostly and predominantly throughout Europe, but certainly many with family here in the United States are also attempting to rejoin family. Some of the concerns that I have related to upcoming changes is there's an intended reversal of Title 42. And so for those who aren't familiar, Title 42 is a public health emergency circumstance that limits the number of individuals that can cross the border and file for asylum here in the United States. It's been in place since the early days of the pandemic as part of a public health mitigation strategy that was implemented under the prior administration and continued in the current administration. Ultimately, we need to move to a place where Title 42 is no longer in place. But my concern is whether we are indeed prepared to make that shift. Certainly, my inquiry to Secretary Mayorkas and to Department of Homeland Security is, what is the plan? What is the plan that we have to contend with what we know will be an increase surge of immigration towards the southern border? Notably, seasonally, we see shifts in migration towards the southern border anyway. So independent of any changes that may or may not occur with Title 42, we should anticipate an increase. I want to know what the plan is from the Department of Homeland Security to contend with increases in potential encounters, apprehensions, and detentions for onward processing. Currently, Border Patrol is at or exceeding its capacity, its operational capacity at this moment. Certainly, we have in the omnibus provided greater funding to DHS, but ensuring that they have all that they need in terms of personnel, technology, resources, supplies, humanitarian supplies, food, and resources for anyone who may be held in detention or be processed through our system. These are all of the questions I have in terms of what are the needs that they anticipate and what are the plans to ensure that we're meeting those needs. It is imperative that when we have a shift in policy, we are prepared for it. So I've been I think it's important that this plan be laid out, clearly defined, well before any changes in border policy are implemented. In this case, at the current moment, it would be Title 42. And this is a humanitarian priority as well, because certainly my background is in national security. I'm a former CIA officer. I worked for a time in what was then called the Counter Narcotics Center. CIA undertook some naming convention changes, but the Counter Narcotics Center, in that role, I tracked drug smuggling throughout the world. For a time, I was handling an asset who was reporting on cartels operating throughout Mexico and the impact of their dealings, their financial engagement, and their violence on the stability of the Mexican government and regional governments. And so noting that surges in migration also equate to increased revenue for narco traffickers and cartels is yet another aspect of this larger discussion related to immigration. I certainly want to protect every person who might be interested in arriving at the United States, claiming asylum, working here, coming as a refugee, whatever the parameters or the need that begins their desire to move to our country. it's incredibly important that they avoid potential violence on that 1,000-mile long journey, depending upon their point of origination, the thousands upon thousands of US dollars that it costs to pay smugglers to get one to the border or across the border. And then the increased revenues and what that might mean for narco traffickers is something that's of great concern to me. I did have legislation under the last administration, bipartisan legislation focused on informing and planning our strategies related to the border, building on intelligence related to narco traffickers and human traffickers. That was bipartisan legislation that I led with Republican Will Hurd from Texas, and it was signed into law by President Trump. So certainly, Richard, this has been an area of great interest and long interest, and I think that it's imperative that we uphold our country's values, certainly ensure the safety and security of anyone who might be interested in filing for asylum or potentially working in the United States. And we need to recognize the operational constraints and challenges that our border agencies face and be prepared to ensure they have the resources that they need. One more comment there, among the other things that I'm urging the administration to consider would be third country review for asylum cases. Certainly, this is something that's currently done with minors. Being able to expand it out to single adult travelers or fuller families is potentially a way that we can relieve some of the numbers that may surge towards the border, but also ensure that we're watching out for and ensuring not just the safety of those who might be otherwise making longer treks towards the southern border, but also denying revenue to the human traffickers who would charge them exorbitant amounts of money to make that charge. So those are among the things that I'm expressing concern over. Legislation of various elements that I'm working on. Certainly that bill that I passed last Congress with Congressman Hurd, and I'm continuing to press the administration for fulsome plans that include how we might contend with not just the numbers of individuals at the border, but the impact that has on resources, individuals, certain staffing, technology, et cetera, but also the impact that it has on the whole of the hemisphere in terms of potential increased revenues to human traffickers and destabilizing implications that might have in Mexico and the rest of Central America. So stay tuned. I'll continue to be publicly pushing out information related to the actions that I might take in this space. But I appreciate your concern, Richard, and I appreciate you raising it in a way where I have the opportunity to speak to a variety of different elements of this larger discussion. And because I took so long answering the question, of course, I want to say a lot more related to the Farm Workforce Modernization Act and the Dream and Promise Act, but I feel that I've gone lengthy. If anyone wants to hear more about those specific pieces of legislation that sort of meet the economic and demands of the United States, then I'm happy to follow up. But I could probably spend another 10 minutes filibustering on this, and I wish to get to the next question. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your question, Richard.
All right. Thank you, Congresswoman. As a reminder, the forum is interactive, and we'd love to hear your questions. If you have a question, you can press *3 on your keypad at any time to get in the queue to ask a question. A member of Congresswoman Spanberger's staff will collect your questions. You can also ask a question by submitting one through the portal below our online streaming player at spanberger.house.gov. Again, that's spanberger.house.gov/live. If you're watching on Facebook Live tonight and you wish to ask Congresswoman Spanberger a question, we encourage you to visit that online streaming portal so you can submit your question. Now back to the phones, we're going to go to Brandon. Brandon has a question about inflation. Brandon, you're on live now with the Congresswoman.
Hey, thank you, Congresswoman, for taking the time. My question is, it deals with inflation, but I think part of that is, as we go around in our daily lives, we see so many of the policies and both parties sort of playing to the extremes on either end of the spectrum. And what it feels like, I think, for most average Americans is that we're getting left behind in the dust. In other words, nobody seems to really be listening to the concerns that we have. One of your previous speakers talked about the border. I think everybody's concerned about inflation. We've got social issues that are going on. Recently, the president discussed additional restrictions on guns. And I think for a lot of us, we're asking the question of, are we addressing crime? In other words, we're talking about guns, but are we truly going to the problem and addressing crime? There are a lot of people who are killed with knives and other types of weapons besides ghost guns. I know that that's important. So my question for you, and I appreciate you taking the time, is where do you stand on a lot of these issues that I think are impacting, regardless of whether it's Democrat or Republican, but most of us in the center who see a lot of these issues with inflation, crime, and some of these other social issues, and where do you stand on these, and what are you doing to address some of these problems within your capacity?
Thank you so much for this question. So I am focused on trying to find solutions, in some cases where we can solve a problem outright, I'm trying to do that. Where we have to kind of hit at a problem in different places from different angles, I'm trying to do that. I also share your frustration with some of the hyper-partisanship that certainly has invaded Capitol Hill. And, I am proud that I am rated by the Lugar Center as the most bipartisan member of the Virginia delegation. And what that means to me, and the reason that I was receiving that award, and then I will get to your question, is that, I work really hard to build coalitions. I work really hard to build bipartisan coalitions around good ideas, and garner support for those ideas and work to try and get them across the finish line. The border security bill that I worked on with Will Hurd, that's how we achieve that. I do a lot as it relates to addiction and recovery, lowering the cost of prescription drugs, and much of this work, ensuring that rural hospitals, representing a district such as this that has so many rural communities, that rural hospitals are receiving the rebates that are owed to them that help them care for their communities and populations. All of these things, I build out bipartisan coalitions. But for the everyday things that are impacting everyday people, well, first and foremost, I would say, I'm an everyday person. I'm impacted by the challenges that everyone else on the call is facing. And I also then have the unique responsibility to advocate for changes and for legislation that would impact it. So if we're talking about inflation, right? Inflation wasn't caused in a day, it won't be fixed in a day. But there are things that we can do to impact the experience that you or I have at the grocery store when we see the costs of food going up. And so I mentioned in my opening remarks the legislation related to truck drivers, because whether I'm with cattle producers or loggers or small businesses within the district or truck drivers, one of the things that I hear about so frequently is that a gap in the supply chain, a challenge in the supply chain, is the fact that we have a shortage of 80,000 truck drivers nationwide, and we are feeling that here at home. And so the bill that I worked on and introduced with Rep. Gallagher from Wisconsin is meant to recruit and retain truck drivers. It has the endorsement of multiple truck driving associations, both national and local, as well as other organizations that depend on truck drivers to make their businesses go, because it's thoughtful legislation that will get at the heart of this problem. Another example of trying to address these challenges is the cost of meat. Among all of the things that we purchase, meat has been one of the places where we've seen real surges in prices. I also represent in our district many cattle producers who are particularly impacted by the centralization, and I would call it the monopolization, in the meatpacking industry. And so I led two efforts. One is a bipartisan bill called the Butcher Block Act that would make it easier for local meat processors, so local large scale butchers, to be created in communities across Virginia so that our cattle producers are not dependent on these sort of choke points that really control the market, and that would allow them to sell locally and have USDA certification when they do so. So this bill is a really important and relatively common sense solution, and some of it, I'm proud to say, has actually been enacted by rulemaking by USDA because it is such a straightforward effort in making the system better. Another element of the problem is that there is a monopoly of these large-scale meat producers. And so I'm leading legislation in the House, and Senator Tester has it in the Senate, that would move forward with an investigation because these monopolies are not only pushing smaller meat processors out of business or making it impossible for them to enter the market, but it has downstream impacts on meat producers right here in Virginia, and that has downstream impacts on you and me at the grocery store. And so these are the sorts of things that I'm working on. They're not the flashiest of solutions, but if you're a cattle producer in Nottoway County, it matters. And if you're buying meat somewhere along the line, it matters. As it relates to gas prices, and this is a space where I've been really pretty forceful with the administration, urging them to release from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, because part of the challenge that we see has been ebbs and flows in demand and supply. And certainly, while we had increasing gas prices in part due to the pandemic and supply chains, certainly we've seen heightened uncertainty in global oil markets because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so I pushed for the administration to release from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and they did. And now we are seeing the barrels of oil, the prices are decreasing, but locally at the price, while we've seen a slight decrease, and driving up and down 95 between Capitol Hill and the district, certainly I keep an eye on prices. So there is some variation, but we have seen some small decreases, which gives me a bit of hope, but it hasn't kept pace with the decrease in overall production. So it hasn't kept pace with the overall reduction in price of the barrel of oil. Just last week, the United States House of Representatives and the Senate had oil executives come before Congress to ensure that to question them about what's happening, why prices are not being why prices are not falling now that there's increased supply, and also to question as to why it is that there's more than 9,000 unused leases that these oil companies possess and are choosing not to pump from. So, these are the sorts of, some of these actions in response to your question are legislative actions that I've taken. Some of them are efforts that I've taken direct with the administration. Certainly, President Biden came out with an announcement today related to ethanol, which is something, his announcement is something I'll be tracking very, very closely in terms of what that might mean for energy production. I think ultimately, I also am a member of the bipartisan group, the Problem Solvers Caucus. We're 29 Democrats and 29 Republicans who endeavor to work together on a whole host of issues. We certainly don't agree on everything, but the intent is that we want to build coalitions around good ideas and try to find solutions to problems, even to some of the most contentious issues. Notably, and I'll end with this, 3 years ago, I traveled to the border when there was a particular surge at that time of individuals to the border. I traveled to the border with a bipartisan delegation to ensure that not only could I see the circumstance and ask questions both next to and in front of my colleagues from across the aisle, but that they had that same experience. And that group, in fact, we, upon our return back to Capitol Hill, worked on a couple different pieces of legislation focused on trying to get at the challenges of many years delayed in terms of immigration reform. One of the bills that we worked on as an entity, and now I get to talk about it, was the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, which is a bill that recognizes that throughout our communities, particularly our agricultural communities, there is a significant need for labor and for foreign-born labor, and that there is a significant number of people who are most willing and excited and proud to do that work. And would love to get visas to be able to do so legally. And there are many employers who would love to bring people to the United States to work either in seasonal labor or year-round labor at dairies and greenhouses, or seasonal with some of our row crops throughout the district and the country. This bipartisan piece of legislation passed the House of Representatives with strong bipartisan support. It provides for the security of knowing who is entering the country through the utilization of E-Verify. And it also ensures that employers throughout the country have access to the workforce that they want to hire legally. The bill passed the House of Representatives with bipartisan support and was not able to garner a vote in the Senate. But these are the sorts of, some of the bills I've mentioned have moved forward. Some have moved forward in the House, are facing some hurdles in the Senate, but I'll keep doing the work of trying to push to remove those hurdles and come up with some of these pretty straightforward solutions to the challenges that people face. But I appreciate this question and the opportunity to speak to a variety of issues related to inflation.
All right, thank you. Next up, we have Jamie is a nurse who's concerned with rising mental health issues. Jamie, you're on live with Congresswoman Spanberger. What is your question?
Hello, and thank you for everything that you are doing to support Virginia. I am in the healthcare industry and a nurse, and I work in the Richmond, Virginia area. I guess my concerns, pre and post-COVID and still dealing with COVID is our mental health crisis, our substance abuse disorder crisis, rural health, and homeless populations. And then what are we doing, once a patient is ready or leaves the hospital and is discharged? Like, where are our programs with some of the issues that I just spoke about? And, our outreach programs that can continue to follow a patient, support a patient for both short-term and long-term goals so that they're not ending back as, repeat citizens coming into our very busy emergency centers. Thank you.
Oh my goodness, Jamie, I really appreciate this question because it gets at the heart of so many things. First and foremost, I want to thank you for your service to our community. As a nurse, my mother is a nurse. I'm a daughter of a nurse, and I am just acutely aware of the tremendous work that you do to keep our community safe. And thank you for advocating for your patients, quite frankly, which is exactly what it is that you're doing in this call with this question. So I want to speak overarching. Jamie mentioned the impact of COVID, the challenges that people are facing. She mentioned addiction and substance use disorders. And I just want to note that we now are at a place where year over year, we had an 18% increase in overdose deaths last year. Since 2013, in the Commonwealth of Virginia, overdose is the leading cause of unnatural death. So higher than car accidents, higher than other accidents. It is the leading cause of unnatural death in Virginia. And even with that high rate, we had a record number of overdoses during the pandemic. And so I have worked on issues related to mental health, related to substance use disorder in a variety of different ways up until recently, when recently I introduced a really substantial piece of legislation that I'm proud of. The prior ways that I've worked on it has been in the American Rescue Plan, ensuring that money that went to localities and schools had significant flexibility for our school systems and our localities to be able to utilize those funds to support mental health crises, to support substance use disorder and recovery, to support children facing unique stressors caused by the pandemic. I've also led an effort to have a 10% set aside of dollars focused on recovery efforts. So within the substance abuse block grant funding, we have dollars for treatment, for prevention, for education. And we have incredible organizations throughout Virginia and the rest of the country that utilize these dollars to support our community. And so frequently, by the time we get to that person in recovery, so that person who's battled their addiction, they're trying to maintain their recovery, but particularly with the stresses of the pandemic, they have faltered. And they need additional support. And that's where this set aside would say we need to lock in those dollars so that our community's investment, Jamie's investment in keeping people safe and helping them through their addiction is able to be realized into a long-term reality of somebody who moves from short-term recovery to long-term recovery. And so I want to talk about my most recent effort in this space, which is called the Summer Barrow Act. And it is legislation that, it's actually called the Summer Barrow Prevention, Treatment, and Recovery Act. And it's legislation that's named after a young woman who died in the 7th District. And, throughout my time in Congress and actually even as a candidate before I was ever elected, I've had the extraordinary opportunity to hear from family members, from loved ones, from parents about someone they have lost to addiction. And what I have found upon my arrival to Capitol Hill is just about everybody is touched some way or knows someone who's been touched by addiction or by overdose. And in my conversations, not just with healthcare providers like Jamie, but recovery advocates, we have some incredible recovery organizations in Virginia. We have incredible work being done in some of our jails that are doing really proactive engagement efforts to help people in their recovery. And law enforcement, I have heard directly from law enforcement officers, sheriffs, and police chiefs about the challenges that they face time and time again, and the stressors that their officers face and deputies face time and time again when they're responding to these healthcare crises and mental health crises. So this bill, the Summer Barrow Prevention, Treatment, and Recovery Act, what it does is it pulls out 12 programs, so existing programs that we know work, that help our communities, to create a comprehensive response to how we can address substance use disorder. And it reauthorizes these grant programs to support states and communities' local work, and recognizes the value of them. And among some of the things that they do, I'll just give a couple examples, is it encourages alternates to opioid use. So many of the individuals with whom I've spoken who have developed a substance use disorder, particularly as it relates to opioids, began with a prescription from a doctor. They had a tooth pulled, they had a surgery, a woman had a cesarean section. They're prescribed opioids, they become addicted, and very quickly their addiction turns to heroin. And in tragically too many cases, they overdose. So ensuring that there's alternatives to opioids and that patients are well versed of the risk with opioids. Expanding jail diversion programs. Certainly, Jamie mentioned that people who come through the ER, where else are they supposed to go? People who are experiencing homelessness and mental health crisis, where else are they supposed to go? Well, many of the people who flow into our jail system are individuals who have severe mental illness, or who are struggling with addiction, which is why some of our community's jails have created recovery programs within the jails. But in talking to the leaders of these programs, they're the first ones to say, the jail is not where this should be. This should be a resource within the community so that somebody doesn't ever get to jail. And so this program would this bill would continue those grant programs. It would also improve access to emergency treatment and really ensure that there's essential programs for those who are homeless, also experiencing mental illness, so that they can get the support that they need. And I want to just thank Jamie for this question, because there's so many aspects to this larger issue, certainly as a mental health provider. I also just wanted to note that there's a bill that I was proud to co-sponsor and vote for called the Lorna Breen Healthcare Provider Protection Act, which supports healthcare providers' access to mental health services and to protect them and to fight against the stigma of seeking treatment. This bill was signed into law. And while I'm proud to have co-sponsored and voted for it, I'm sad that it is in fact named after a Virginia healthcare provider who, during the darkest days of the pandemic, was struggling with some of what she had seen and took her own life. But I'm proud that we can remember her legacy by making sure that healthcare providers as well are able to receive the support that they need, especially during these ongoing challenges that we face in our communities. So again, Jamie, thank you for your work, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about a bill that I care so much about.
Well, in addition to the telephone questions, a number of online questions in our queue, so let's go there next. And Congresswoman, this is a question from Molly. Molly asks, We've come up with ways to give seniors access to free or affordable health care, but our patients still are having a hard time paying for prescriptions. How quickly can we see a difference in costs? And thank you for all you've done.
Well, it's too bad that that question isn't from someone on the phones, because I would want to ask a follow-up question. But I think that what we're talking about here is that seniors who are on Medicare, certainly there's significant benefits to being on Medicare. But when it comes to prescription drugs, those can still be so incredibly costly. This is why, and if you've listened to prior town halls, you've most certainly heard me talk about this bill before. This is why I've been such a proponent of H.R. 3, the Lower Prescription Drug Costs Now Act. And that bill would ensure that Medicare can negotiate the cost of its prescription drugs and be able to actually negotiate for cost savings. Currently, and this may seem just extraordinary within our capitalist country, but Medicare is prohibited by law from negotiating the cost of the prescription drugs that it utilizes. And those costs go to Medicare users. In the VA system, the VA can negotiate. Of course, if you have a private insurer, they can negotiate. But here we have Medicare legally prohibited from being able to negotiate. So H.R. 3 would allow for Medicare to be able to negotiate the cost of prescription drugs, and then it would actually allow for commercial insurers to be able to leverage those same negotiated rates. So the benefit is not only to those who utilize Medicare, but in fact, anyone kind of across the board in the United States that utilizes prescription drugs. This bill's passed the House with bipartisan support. I am working to ensure that it can move forward in the Senate, but that does not seem like it's on the quick horizon. So we worked on a different version that would allow Medicare to negotiate certain drugs, not all of them, but certain drugs, and also to cap the price of Medicare Part D copays, right? Which would be incredibly important, allow for seniors, presumably on a fixed income, to know and be able to plan for what their prescription drug prices would be. This is another piece of legislation that passed through the House. We're continuing to advocate. I'm continuing to advocate for this bill to move in the House and then ultimately in the Senate. So it would cap, again, prescription drug costs at $2,000 a year, which is just transformative. And in fact, I guess I would note that I brought President Biden to Culpeper County, Virginia, in our district, to hear directly from people that I represent about the impact of prescription drug prices and exorbitant prescription drug prices on their families. We had young constituents, we had seniors on Medicare, everybody in between, because I want to make clear to the President of the United States, and most importantly, I want the people I represent to make clear directly to the President of the United States that this is an issue that is an important one here in Virginia and certainly across the country. And when I talk about the inability of Medicare to be able to negotiate the cost of prescription drugs and how that that implication is not just a negative impact for those who require drugs, but frankly, for anybody who's utilizing Medicare. I think you have probably seen some of the news reports related to the Alzheimer's drug that costs $56,000 a year. And when there was a recent announcement in changes in Medicare premiums, that was because that $56,000 a year was just the cost that the drug company said they would be charging, and there was not even an option for Medicare to be able to negotiate. So it's not just about lowering the cost of prescription drugs, which of course is part and parcel of it, but it's also, by extension, being able to lower premiums as well.
All right, thank you. As a quick reminder that this is an interactive forum and we'd love to hear your questions. If you do have a question, you can press *3 on your keypad at any time to get in the queue to ask a question. A member of Congresswoman Spanberger's staff will collect your question. You can also ask a question by submitting one through the portal below our online streaming player at spanberger.house.gov. Again, that's spanberger.house.gov/live. If you're watching on Facebook Live tonight and wish to ask Congresswoman Spanberger a question, We encourage you to visit that online streaming portal so you can submit your question. And now we're going to go back to the phones. We got Paul from Louisa. Paul's got a question about Ukraine. Paul, you're now on live with Congresswoman Spanberger. What is your question?
Honorable Representative Spanberger, many of us have become very emotional about the war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It brings for some of us in our 60s, it brings us back to relatives who may have come from Europe in World War II. And I'm trying not to become emotional about this, but my question is: at what point? I know we don't want to invoke nuclear action. We're afraid of nuclear action. I also know that, look, we have you, the CIA, we have MI5, and we have Mossad to potentially take out Putin. But at what point, in your opinion, and perhaps you cannot voice this, but at what point, in your opinion, do we trigger us getting involved and NATO getting involved to save these people in Ukraine?
Thank you for this question. And so much of what you touched upon is a topic of regular conversation and debate. So I'll try to touch on a couple things. Which one, I think that the images that we have seen coming out of Ukraine have been more and more horrifying day by day. And I'll get, and the reality of that, I'm a mother. I have 2 elementary school children, a middle school child, and the images of children who've been killed, or women and their babies in a maternity ward who've been bombed, trains that have been attacked, families that have been murdered in the streets. The reality of what this war is, what this grotesque invasion is I think becoming ever clearer day by day. And the atrocities that the Russian soldiers have committed with Vladimir Putin at the helm are reprehensible. So let me talk through, from an American perspective, what it is that we have done, and how it is that we continue to help. And I recognize and I continue to be questioning every single day, what's next? What comes next? What do we do next? First and foremost, we led and have led our partners in imposing crushing sanctions, which has destabilized Russia's economy, made them a pariah on the world stage, and we've done it in a way that has unified our NATO and our security partners the world over. I have worked on and co-sponsored legislation that would not just sanction Russian oligarchs and those who are the subject of sanctions, but seize their items so that when we can assist in the rebuilding of Ukraine, we will do it with the ill-gotten gains. I would argue actually the well-gotten gains of the items that we have sanctioned and seized from those who enable this horrific war. We have provided substantial military assistance, certainly the Stingers and the Javelins, Switchblade drones, all of which the Ukrainians have used in an exceptional way as they continue defending themselves and their democracy. We have facilitated and worked with other partner countries to facilitate the transfer of other lethal aid weapon systems. The recent announcement that Slovakia will be providing S-300 is such an important and timely announcement, and it's one that is made possible because the United States will be backfilling their capacity with American-made weapons. And this is an important step forward, a really valuable one, and one that I'm proud that the United States helped facilitate. Those are the sorts of things that we are doing out in the open and fully clear. We're also providing medical supplies and intelligence and information to the Ukrainians, and have been supporting their actions directly in a whole host of ways. I believe that in your question, it was, well, what do we do to trigger, what comes next, and what are the concerns related to triggering a response? And you mentioned NATO in your question. So for anyone listening who may not have been following this as closely, the challenge that we continue to face is that we are in an alliance with our fellow NATO countries. And so the minute we are engaged in a wartime conflict, we are essentially triggering the involvement of all those other countries, which is the challenge when we talk about issues related to whether we engage militarily, we send U.S. soldiers. The issue there is that our decision to send U.S. soldiers would be a decision essentially to send all of NATO. And that is the challenge that exists. I was heartened by the visit that we saw of Boris Johnson to Kyiv to visit with Zelensky. Certainly, I hope that we will see various members of the administration follow suit and have on-the-ground visits with Ukrainian leadership to demonstrate our support for them and ongoing support. But I think that what is also an important parameter to get to your question is, I think we'll know more in the coming days. There's, of course, reports that there may have been a chemical attack potentially against civilians by Russians. And so recognizing the reality or the truth behind that will be an important determiner of what comes next. But I do think it's very important that this administration has not put out any stated red lines, because I think the worst thing that we could do would be to state a red line and then not adhere to it. So I will tell you that there are constant briefings for members of Congress, and I serve on the Foreign Affairs Committee and certainly have more briefings due to that assignment. There are constant briefings for the whole of Congress, and particularly those of us with relevant committees, and we are day by day continuing to assess the circumstances on the ground, U.S. level of engagement. And I will tell you that I continue to encourage the administration that certainly there is a line where we would trigger NATO involvement, but we should spend every single day pressed up against that line, supporting the Ukrainians with everything and anything that they need in order to be able to defend themselves, their people, and their democracy. Their bravery is astounding, and I'm really grateful that people here on the ground in Virginia's 7th District are thinking of them, advocating for them, and holding me accountable for with questions about what the United States is doing now and into the future. I can also provide additional information related to the provision of thousands of sets of body armor and helmet, billions of dollars in support, but I can follow that up with you on that, sir, if you'd be interested in additional kind of listed details. So thank you for the question.
All right, thank you. Next up, we're going to go to Wayne on the phone. Wayne is from Henrico, and he has got a question about inflation. Wayne, you're on live with Congresswoman Spanberger.
Thank you very much. My number one concern is inflation. Today, the federal government announced that the CPI index for the first quarter is 8.3%, the highest in decades. I voted for President Biden in 2020, but now I'm totally disenchanted with him and Democrats by the fact that much of our huge increase in inflation is due to actions by Biden. And I am very exasperated by the fact he has not taken any responsibility for it. I'll give you two examples. He put 8,000 of my union brothers out of work when he stopped the Keystone Pipeline. And he also imposed, when he came in office, very restrictive regulations on the oil companies in the area of R&D of new oil refineries. Question: what are you doing, you personally doing, to stand up to President Biden and Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi to put the voters first in fighting inflation?
Thank you for this question, and thank you for being so honest with where you were in 2020 and what your disappointments are. And I've been quoted before as saying, and in fact, it's been used to attack me that ultimately the buck stops with the president. But I think that's real, regardless of the source of inflation, and certainly, I would make the statement that inflation isn't caused by any one thing. It's been a variety of circumstances, and certainly in a global pandemic, we had circumstances like nothing we've ever seen before. But ultimately, it's the president of the United States' responsibility to try and work with us, members of Congress, the communities, to rectify these problems. And so I have been very clear in the fact that regardless of the cause, it's our responsibility to contend with it. So in terms of the things that I have been doing to deal with inflation, I mentioned some of the supply chain related issues specifically that cause an increase of prices when we are at the grocery store, at the pump, and out and about living our daily lives. Notably, when it comes to other things we can be doing to combating inflation, it comes down to the types of investments that we're making. And certainly I have heard and continue to hear from some constituents that, in the early days of the pandemic and continuing on, that we spent a lot. Most of it was bipartisan in nature, but we ensured that small businesses would survive. We ensured that localities had the resources they need to contend with just extraordinary circumstances of the pandemic. And I continue to believe that ensuring that the small businesses that are the economic drivers across our district, that they can survive, is incredibly important. And so I think that we've made good choices as it relates to supporting small businesses, as it relates to supporting communities and schools. And then looking towards the future, we need to recognize that we are not out of the woods. Inflation, as you mentioned, is at record-breaking levels, which is something that should be an alarm moment for anyone. And so among the things that I have done, apart from related to truck driver legislation, supply chain related legislation, urging the administration to appoint a supply chain czar, which they have not yet done, but I think is important to have a whole of government approach, urging the administration to release from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which they have done. I continue to advocate for us to pass bipartisan pieces of legislation that would meaningfully impact the needs across our communities, and that are focused on the things that, frankly, I'm hearing from you all. In fact, it makes me realize an earlier caller discussed crime in a question, and I think I didn't fully answer that aspect of the question. So I would add, I have drafted and sponsored legislation that would provide nearly triple the funding to the community-oriented policing grant. So those are the COPS funding. Because in fact, when we're looking at the challenges of crime that we're facing in our community, some of it's related to the ongoing addiction crisis. Some of it's related to ongoing mental health crisis, and I got to some of the challenges there. But we also need a strong and well-trained police force here in our 10 counties across our district, but across the country. And so investing in community-oriented policing programs, grant programs that allow for recruitment and vetting and training of our law enforcement is part and parcel, particularly at a time when we continue to see our first responders, be they EMS and fire, be they law enforcement, or be they the folks when you arrive at the emergency room, continue to see some of the most tragic and difficult circumstances that they've seen in their career. And I recently spoke with one of the providers in our district at an EMS fire chief, who was saying that right now, folks going out on calls are seeing things that it previously would have taken somebody 15, 20 years to see. And they're seeing it time and time again. And the stressors that creates are real challenges. Create real challenges for them, for the departments, and for our overall response. And so, what I seek to illustrate in this answer is that there are pieces of meaningful legislation and meaningful change that we can enact that have impact on people. And while not related to inflation, I also do a lot of work related to trying to clean up Congress. I have a background in national security, and I think it's incredibly important that every person on this call who might agree with my answers, might disagree with my answers, might agree with my policy, or disagree with my policy should know that every day I am working for the people of this district. Whether you like the job I'm doing or not is a different question. And so I am leading efforts, which the last caller asked about where I might be pushing up against leadership in Congress. And surely this is one place where I'm advocating for the prohibition of members of Congress, House or Senate, being able to trade in individual stocks. Certainly, there's been unbelievable allegations, though they're true, of members of Congress who in the early days of the pandemic are buying Pfizer stock, members of Congress as Russia is invading Ukraine buying Lockheed Martin stock. And so it is just outrageous to me that while any member of Congress, or while any member of Congress is contending with the challenges before facing the people of our communities, that they might be buying or selling individual stock. So while not related to the issue of inflation, certainly, and I recognize that, I think it's important from a good governance standpoint to demonstrate that I think that you, constituents, people I represent here in the 7th District, should know that any member of Congress is constantly focused on public service and not their own portfolio. And that's why I continue to push for us to be able to ban members of Congress from trading individual stocks. It's not the best way to make friends on Capitol Hill, actually, but I believe in it, so I continue to work for it and to get that legislation moving forward. But thank you for this question, and certainly, sir, thank you for your advocacy on behalf of your union brothers and sisters, and thank you for your questions.
And that's going to bring us to the end of our Q&A portion of the town hall this evening. We're coming to an end of our live event. But before we go, I'm going to turn the floor back over to Congresswoman Spanberger for some final comments.
Thank you so much for all of your questions this evening. Certainly, I think that they touched upon the issues that I hear about most frequently when I am out and about across our 10 counties. Inflation, prices at the grocery store, gas prices, certainly the concerns that people have related to the border, concerns that people have related to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and overall concerns about mental health, substance use disorder, and some of the uncertainty that exists in today's day and age. So I appreciate the opportunity to share with you the work that I've been doing on Capitol Hill, and certainly the advocacy that I've been working on legislatively for bills that would meaningfully impact so many of these issues. I thank you for your time this evening. Thank you for joining me. And I would like to remind everyone that if you're having any challenges with a federal agency, that I would urge you to give our office a call, 804-401-4110. And we send out regular updates with updates from our office, a newsletter from our office, and you can sign up on our website at spanberger.house.gov. Thank you so very much for joining. And again, to all who will be celebrating Easter and Passover or Greek Easter in another week, I wish you all a wonderful week, a beautiful celebration, and thank you again for joining us.
That's going to conclude our town hall for this evening. Thanks again for taking the time to join us for this important Virginia-focused telephone town hall with Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger. We appreciate the opportunity to answer your questions, but if you were not able to ask your question this evening, you can still call our district office at 804-401-4110 during normal business hours or go to spanberger.house.gov. Thank you again, stay safe, and have a good evening.